Wealth isn't disappearing. It's changing hands.
The next 10 years won't reward hustle. They'll reward better decisions. I'm Chi-Chi, tracking capital before it trends.
I'm Will, 20 years navigating real market cycles. The edge today isn't more information. It's sharper judgment. This is Align Wealth 2040.
Clarity,
Strategy.
action.
Welcome everyone, thank you for being here. Today I want to talk about something much bigger than money. I want to talk about financial independence in an era where the rules of work, value, and wealth are being rewritten in real time. For a long time, many families were told that the formula was simple: work hard, save steadily, invest consistently, and eventually everything should work out. But we are entering a different kind of environment now. Artificial intelligence is changing how income is earned, how labor is valued, and how capital compounds. So the question is no longer just, how much money do I make? The deeper question is my family's financial structure strong enough for the world that is coming? That is what today is about, not fear, not hype, but structure, clarity, and action. Before we go further, a brief disclosure. This presentation is for educational and strategic planning purposes only. It is not tax, legal, or investment advice. Every family has a different income profile, tax situation, balance sheet, risk tolerance, and long-term goal set. So as you listen today, I want you to think in principles, not prescriptions. Think about how these ideas may apply to your own family, and then make specific decisions with qualified professionals who understand your situation in detail. The goal today is to help you think more clearly, see the structural issues earlier, and make better decisions over time. Let's begin with part 1, the new wealth paradigm. What is changing right now is not just technology, it is the architecture of wealth itself. In many past cycles, people could afford to be a little passive. They could keep doing roughly what everyone else was doing and still make reasonable progress. But in this new era, passive financial behavior becomes much more dangerous. AI is not just another productivity tool, it is a force multiplier. It changes the relationship between labor and output. It changes who captures value. It changes which assets become more strategic and which sources of income become more fragile. So when we say there is a new wealth paradigm, what we really mean is this: families can no longer rely on old assumptions if the underlying system has changed. At the deepest level, we are seeing a fundamental restructuring of wealth. Historically, most people thought of wealth in fairly familiar ways: cash, home equity, retirement accounts, maybe a business, maybe some investment properties, and of course those still matter. But in the AI era, there is another layer underneath all of that. The benchmark of future wealth is increasingly tied to ownership of productive systems: energy, compute, infrastructure, scalable capital, intellectual leverage, distribution. These are the forces shaping the next cycle. Why does this matter for everyday families? Because when algorithms can replicate more and more forms of active labor, the value of simply selling time becomes easier to compress. The world does not stop rewarding work, but it starts rewarding ownership much more aggressively. So the key question becomes, is your family mainly depending on labor income, or are you gradually positioning toward ownership, protected capital, and compounding systems? This leads us to a major shift: total personal responsibility. Many families still carry an outdated mental model. They assume that if they work steadily, pay taxes, contribute to retirement plans, and stay generally responsible, the larger system will take care of the rest. But the social safety net is under pressure. Worker-to-retiree ratios have deteriorated significantly over time. Pensions have largely disappeared in the private sector. Social security faces long-term strain. Public debt continues to expand, and households are increasingly expected to self-fund more of their own retirement, healthcare, and risk protection. In other words, the old pillars are not as strong as many people think. That does not mean hopelessness, it means clarity. The modern family must assume primary responsibility for building its own financial defense mechanisms instead of assuming the system will do it for them. Now let's talk about the asymmetry of labor and capital. This slide shows a scale for a reason. On one side is active labor, on the other side is capital ownership. And AI is not pressing on both sides equally. If AI increases output, that does not automatically mean everyone benefits proportionally. In many cases, productivity gains concentrate first in the hands of those who own the systems, the platforms, the data, the capital, or the scalable business model. Meanwhile, many forms of knowledge-based labor become easier to automate, cheaper to outsource, or more difficult to price at a premium. That is the asymmetry. If your family's economic engine depends mostly on working more hours, selling more expertise, or maintaining a high but fragile earned income, then the pressure can be significant. But if more of your balance sheet is tied to protected capital, long-term ownership, and systems that produce income without constant personal effort, the picture changes. This is why structure matters more than ever. The result is what I would call a K-shaped wealth bifurcation. As technology accelerates, families do not all move in the same direction. Some move upward because they adapt early, build ownership, use AI to increase leverage, and make deliberate structural decisions. Others fall behind, not necessarily because they are less hardworking, but because they are still operating with an outdated map. The gap may widen faster than people expect. That is why I call this an inflection point. For many families, the next few years will not simply be a continuation of the last 10. This is a period where cognitive gaps can become income gaps, and income gaps can become long-term wealth gaps. So the goal is not to panic, the goal is to awaken early enough to reposition. And that begins with redefining what true independence actually means. Part 2 is about the definition of true independence. Many people say they want financial freedom, but they define it too vaguely. They imagine a feeling, less stress, more flexibility, more options, and those are good goals. But if we do not define independence clearly, then we cannot build toward it intentionally. True financial independence is not about looking rich. It is not about having a high income for a few years. It is not about owning impressive assets that create hidden fragility. True independence is structural. It means your family can absorb shocks, make choices from strength, and continue moving forward even when the environment becomes less favorable. So in this section, we move from theory to architecture. This slide contrasts the illusion of wealth with the reality of wealth. The illusion of wealth is common. A family may have strong W-2 income, visible lifestyle success, a nice home, a few investment accounts, maybe even multiple properties. From the outside, everything looks fine, but underneath there may be very little structural buffer. Cash flow is tight, debt is high, expenses are sticky, assets are concentrated. A job disruption would immediately create stress. A market decline would hit multiple parts of the balance sheet at once. That is not independence. That is dependency wearing expensive clothing. The reality of wealth looks quieter. It is discipline, liquidity, low toxic debt, strong savings rates, protected reserves, intentional asset placement, optionality. Real wealth does not just impress people. Real wealth gives a family resilience, flexibility, and peace. That is why I like the financial needs analysis framework. Think of your financial life like an engineered structure, not a pile of unrelated products. A strong structure has layers, and each layer has a purpose. Layer 1 is liquidity and structural protection. Before growth, before optimization, before legacy, you need stability, you need access, you need breathing room. Layer 2 is toxic debt elimination. If high-interest debt is draining your cash flow, compounding is working against you. Layer 3 is capital leverage and passive income. This is where assets start working harder on your behalf. Layer 4 is cross-cycle legacy. This is where strategy extends beyond your own lifetime and becomes multi-generational. Many families try to jump straight to the top of the pyramid without strengthening the base, but wealth built without proper architecture is vulnerable, especially in volatile times. This brings us to the shrinking half-life of active income. For many decades, professional income was treated almost like a safe asset. If you had a strong degree, strong work ethic, and a respected role, that income stream felt durable. But the durability of active income is changing. AI filtration and compression mean that some tasks are becoming easier to automate, easier to augment, and therefore harder to monetize at previous levels. This is happening not only in manual jobs, but also in finance, law, coding, operations, analysis, and many forms of white-collar work. So the risk is not always immediate replacement. Sometimes the risk is wage compression, fewer opportunities, slower advancement, or the need to compete in a much more crowded field. That is why relying solely on active income has become more fragile than many families realize. It is not enough to make good money. You need to convert income into structure before the window narrows. So what are the 3 hard metrics of independence? Number 1, liquidity. Do you have enough readily available reserves to absorb a major disruption without being forced into bad decisions? For most families, that means at least 6 to 12 months of core expenses depending on the stability of income and complexity of obligations. Number 2, debt elimination. Have you severed the high-interest, toxic liabilities that quietly drain your momentum? Not all debt is equal, but consumer debt with persistent high interest is a structural enemy. Number 3, passive coverage. Do you have assets or systems producing income that can cover the family's baseline expenses even partially and eventually fully? If these 3 areas are weak, the family may still look successful, but it is not yet financially independent in a durable sense. If, as you listen to these 3 metrics, you realize your structure may not be where you want it to be, that is exactly why we offer complimentary one-on-one strategy sessions with our team. If you'd like help evaluating your liquidity, debt exposure, and passive income position, you can schedule a conversation using the link in the video description. Now we move into part 3, the invisible wealth killers. These are the forces that quietly erode a family's progress, often without obvious warning at first. They do not usually show up as dramatic headlines in a single day. Instead, they work slowly, mathematically, and relentlessly over time. And the problem is that many families underestimate them because they are not emotionally dramatic at the beginning. Today I want to highlight 4 of them: inflation, drawdowns, average return illusions, and extended lifespan risk. If you ignore these 4, even a high-income family can still end up structurally weak later on. The first invisible killer is inflation. Inflation is dangerous because it feels gradual. It does not usually arrive as one obvious event. Instead, it quietly erodes purchasing power year after year. This slide illustrates that clearly. A lifestyle that requires $72,000 at age 40 may require more than $214,000 later in life just to maintain the same purchasing power, even under fairly conservative inflation assumptions. That means standing still is not neutral. Holding too much idle cash for too long is not safety. It is silent decay. Families often say they want to preserve wealth, but preservation without growth is often just a slower form of loss. So the goal is not reckless return chasing. The goal is to outpace erosion intelligently and consistently. The second invisible killer is the asymmetry of drawdowns. This is one of the most misunderstood concepts in personal finance. A 50% loss does not require a 50% gain to recover. It requires a 100% gain. That is a massive difference. And this is why downside protection matters so much more than many people think. Large losses create a capital void. They destroy time. They force recovery to become harder, slower, and more emotionally difficult. When markets are rising, many people underestimate this because the pain has not arrived yet. But in real life, especially near retirement or during major life transitions, the order and severity of losses matter tremendously. It is usually far better to avoid the deep hole than to depend on your ability to climb out of it later. The third invisible killer is the average return illusion. This is where many simplistic projections become dangerous. 2 portfolios may show the same long-term average return on paper, but if one experiences major losses earlier, especially during retirement withdrawals, the real-life outcome can be dramatically worse than those experiencing the same losses later. This is the sequence of returns problem. In other words, families do not live inside spreadsheets, they live inside time, and when withdrawals, expenses, retirement timing, and market conditions intersect, the sequence of returns matters, not just the average. This is why some people do everything right and still feel shocked later. They assumed that average return was enough, but average return without path awareness can create false confidence. So we have to move beyond simplistic averages and think structurally. What happens if volatility shows up at the worst possible moment? The fourth invisible killer is extended lifespan risk. This one is especially important because it combines 2 realities at the same time. On one hand, medical progress may extend life expectancy and improve survival. On the other hand, longer life often means a higher probability of needing expensive care later in life. Many families insure very low probability risks, like house fires, but underprepare for high-probability late-life care needs. Yet long-term care exposure can be one of the largest financial black holes in retirement planning. A long care event does not only affect money, it affects dignity, family stress, caregiver burden, and the financial future of the next generation. So when we talk about retirement planning, we cannot only talk about accumulation, we also have to talk about protection against longevity and care-related erosion. Now we enter part 4, the core logic of investing and tax planning. Once a family understands the risks, the next question becomes, how do we build a system that actually keeps more of what we earn, grow, and transfer? Because real wealth is not just about top-line growth. It is about net retained wealth after all the major friction points have done their damage. That means we need to think simultaneously about growth, taxes, inflation, volatility, and time. Most people manage these separately, but wealth is not experienced separately. It is experienced as one integrated outcome. This is why I call it the real wealth equation. Money by itself is not enough. Growth by itself is not enough. Time by itself is not enough. Those only matter if they survive taxes, inflation, and volatility. So instead of asking, what is my return, a better question is, what is my retained return after systemic erosion? That is a much more honest question. Some strategies look strong on the surface but leak value through taxes. Some grow fast but suffer severe volatility. Some appear safe but lose silently to inflation. Some build assets efficiently but transfer them poorly. A family that understands the real wealth equation does not chase one variable in isolation. They optimize the whole machine. This slide compares structural momentum, growth versus decay. On the left, you see the engine of asset compounding. Compounding is one of the most powerful forces in finance because it builds upon itself. When capital is allowed to grow efficiently over time, each cycle strengthens the next one. On the right, you see the black hole of debt erosion. Toxic debt does the opposite. It compounds against you. It creates internal drag. It hollows out cash flow and weakens future flexibility. This is why debt is not just a math problem. It is a structural problem. And it is why disciplined asset growth and disciplined liability management must happen together. A family cannot compound effectively while also letting silent decay continue underneath the surface. Now let's talk about tax planning, one of the largest lifetime expenses most families will ever face. People often focus intensely on investment returns but pay far less attention to tax drag. Yet taxes show up repeatedly across life. You are taxed when you earn, often taxed when you spend, taxed when you realize gains, and potentially taxed again when wealth transfers. This slide makes a simple but powerful point. The difference between taxed growth and tax-advantaged or tax-exempt growth over time can become enormous. That means tax strategy is not just a filing season issue. It is a wealth-building issue, a retirement issue, a legacy issue. Families that fail to plan around tax structure often work very hard for money that ends up leaking away at multiple points. Families that plan proactively tend to retain more of the same economic effort. That brings us to asset positioning and the 3 tax buckets. Every dollar you own is sitting somewhere, and where it sits matters. Bucket 1 is taxable. These are assets where growth, interest, or gains may create ongoing tax friction. Examples include standard brokerage accounts, savings interest, and certain non-qualified investments. Bucket 2 is tax-deferred. Here, taxes are delayed, not eliminated. Traditional retirement accounts often fall into this category. The benefit is current deferral, but future withdrawals may still be fully taxable. Bucket 3 is tax-exempt or tax-advantaged in distribution when structured properly. Roth-style assets are the most familiar example, and in some cases, other strategically designed structures such as 7702 insurance cash value categories may also offer more favorable treatment. The point is not that one bucket is always best. The point is that placement matters. Families need intentional tax diversification, not accidental concentration. This is why tax strategy needs to shift from passive to proactive. Passive tax behavior says, I will just contribute where everyone contributes, withdraw later, and hope tax rates are manageable when I need the money. Proactive tax behavior asks a different set of questions. What kind of tax exposure am I building? Do I have flexibility later? Am I overly concentrated in tax-deferred assets? Am I using available structures strategically? Am I building optionality for retirement, business transitions, or future policy changes? Tax strategy is not about avoiding taxes through gimmicks. It is about lawful, thoughtful positioning over time. In an unstable world, flexibility has value, and tax flexibility can be one of the most underappreciated forms of financial resilience. Now we move into part 5, Building an integrated wealth structure. This is where the ideas begin to come together. The goal is not to collect random financial products. The goal is to build a coordinated system where each part plays a role. Your reserves, insurance, debt strategy, tax positioning, growth assets, downside protection, income design, and legacy planning should not compete with one another. They should work together. An integrated wealth structure gives the family more than return. It gives coherence, and in uncertain times, coherence is a major advantage. One major threat to coherence is hidden correlation risk. Many families believe they are diversified because they own multiple asset types. Maybe they have a home, retirement accounts, tech-heavy equities, private business exposure, and perhaps even some real estate. On paper, that looks diversified. But if several of those assets are all exposed to the same underlying economic engine, the diversification may be thinner than it appears. That is what this slide is showing. Different assets can still share the same source of vulnerability. When a family has concentrated exposure without realizing it, they may discover in a downturn that multiple holdings fall together. So real diversification is not just about counting assets, it is about understanding what is actually driving them underneath the surface. This is why strategic asset allocation matters so much. A large portion of long-term portfolio behavior is driven not by short-term predictions or product selection, but by how assets are positioned structurally. The architecture matters more than the noise. Families often overestimate the importance of finding the perfect investment and underestimate the importance of building the right framework. The right framework considers time horizon, liquidity needs, downside tolerance, tax exposure, income needs, and family objectives. It is not generic. It is engineered. Good allocation does not guarantee perfect outcomes, but poor allocation can create avoidable fragility no matter how hard the family works. So whenever I see a family under stress financially, I often ask first, is the issue really return or is it structure? Now let's discuss downside protection and the idea that zero can be heroic. This phrase sounds simple, but the logic behind it is powerful. When markets decline sharply, avoiding loss can be more valuable than capturing every last bit of upside during the boom. Why? Because losses damage the compounding base. If an asset stays flat during a severe downturn while another falls dramatically, the flat asset begins the recovery from a much stronger position. It does not need to fight back to even, it simply continues forward. This is why floors matter in some structured designs. In certain market environments, not losing can become a major strategic advantage. The point is not that every dollar should be placed into the same kind of strategy. The point is that downside control deserves more respect than many families currently give it. This slide compares a traditional uncapped path with a floor and cap style structure for the past 20 years. The uncapped path can capture more upside in strong years, but it also absorbs full downside in bad years. The structured path may give up some peak return potential, but in exchange it reduces or eliminates certain types of market loss depending on the design. Over time, especially across multiple cycles, that trade-off can be much more attractive than it first appears. Why? Because the family is not only trying to maximize return in good times, the family is trying to maximize sustainable compounding across good times and bad. That is a very different objective, and once you view investing through that lens, many boring protections start to look much more intelligent. The year 2008 remains a useful reference point. When markets fall deeply, the emotional pain is obvious. But the structural damage is even more important. A major drawdown forces future returns to work much harder just to repair what was lost. This slide shows that contrast visually. One path falls into a crater and must climb back. Another preserves principal more effectively and therefore begins the rebound from a higher base. That higher base matters. It affects not just one year, but every year after it. For families nearing retirement, funding college, managing a business transition, or supporting multiple generations, that kind of protection can be especially meaningful. The lesson is not that volatility can be eliminated entirely. The lesson is that damage control is part of smart wealth building. And this principle applies not only to historic crashes, but also to routine corrections. Market disruptions do not happen just once in a lifetime. They show up again and again in different forms. Some are brief, some are severe, some are driven by policy, geopolitics, inflation, rates, credit conditions, or recession fears. A structure that repeatedly limits downside can preserve momentum over many cycles, even if it does not look exciting in any single year. This is one reason patient, durable strategies often outperform more emotional or aggressive approaches over the long run. They survive, they stay in position, they keep compounding. So when evaluating a strategy, do not only ask how it performs in strong years. Ask how it behaves during stress, because stress reveals architecture. Ultimately, winning is often about not losing badly. That may not sound glamorous, but it is one of the deepest truths in wealth building. Many families think success comes from finding spectacular upside. Sometimes it does. But for most real households, success is much more often the result of avoiding catastrophic errors, preserving optionality, and compounding steadily across decades. This mindset also improves behavior. A family that values resilience is less likely to panic, overreact, or chase trends. The strongest wealth structures usually do not depend on being right all the time. They depend on being durable enough to survive being wrong occasionally. That is a very different kind of confidence. This slide highlights the lock-in shield concept. In some structures, prior gains can be locked in periodically, while the principal is shielded from certain forms of downside loss. The exact mechanics vary by design, and every structure has trade-offs, limits, costs, and suitability considerations. But conceptually, this matters because it changes the compounding profile. Instead of participating fully in both the rise and the fall, the family may be able to participate in part of the upside while reducing exposure to severe downside. That creates a different emotional experience and a different mathematical path. This is where the idea of a Swiss Army knife tool comes in. Certain planning structures are versatile because they can potentially address multiple needs at once: accumulation, risk transfer, tax efficiency, liquidity design, and sometimes legacy support, depending on how they are designed and funded. For example, properly structured permanent life insurance is not just about a death benefit in the traditional sense. In some planning cases, it can be part of a broader strategy involving tax-aware access, protection, or family continuity. That does not mean it is right for everyone. It must be evaluated carefully, funded properly, and matched to real goals. But families should at least understand that some tools are multidimensional. They are not just products. They are planning instruments when used intentionally. Strategic college funding planning is another area where structure matters more than most people realize. Many families focus only on saving more, but the real question is also where and how assets are positioned. Because different assets are treated differently in financial aid calculations and broader family planning decisions. If college funding is part of your family's roadmap, then asset allocation, tax planning, ownership structure, and cash flow timing all matter. The goal is not simply to accumulate. The goal is to accumulate intelligently while preserving flexibility and minimizing unintended penalties. This is especially relevant for entrepreneurial families and middle to upper middle income households that may not qualify for obvious aid but still need to manage the economics carefully. College planning is not separate from wealth planning, it is part of it. And this is where personalized planning really matters, because college funding, tax strategy, and asset positioning are never one-size-fits-all. If you want help thinking through your family's situation, you can schedule a complimentary one-on-one strategy session with our team through the link in the video description. Now we come to part 6, the checklist. At this point, the question is not whether these ideas sound interesting. The real question is, what should a family actually do next? Because execution matters more than information. A good strategy that is never implemented produces no result. A delayed decision often becomes a missed compounding window, and a family that waits for perfect certainty usually ends up reacting later under worse conditions. So let's simplify the next step thinking. AI can optimize for speed, pattern recognition, efficiency, and probabilities, but it cannot define what matters most to your family. It cannot tell you how much security you need to sleep well. It cannot define the right trade-off between growth and peace of mind. It cannot decide what kind of legacy you want to leave. That is why true wealth planning must remain human-led. Your wealth strategy should reflect your family values, not just market math. It should fit your season of life, your responsibilities, your convictions, and the people you are trying to protect. The future may become more automated, but the deepest financial decisions should still be aligned with human judgment and family purpose. Execution is the ultimate variable. A 10-year delay in acting can have enormous consequences because time is not replaceable. Once compounding years are lost, they are lost permanently. This is true whether we are talking about saving, tax planning, protection, debt elimination, college strategy, or retirement architecture. Many families do not fail because they lack intelligence. They fail because they postpone important structural decisions while focusing on short-term busyness. They assume they will handle it later when the career stabilizes, when the kids are older, when the market is clearer, when life feels less hectic. But later is often more expensive. The families that benefit most are usually not the ones who know the most. They are the ones who begin early enough and stay consistent long enough. Here is your action checklist for the next 72 hours. First, secure the baseline. Review your liquidity. Make sure you have enough accessible reserves for a real disruption, not just a minor inconvenience. Second, audit your architecture. Look at your debt, your tax exposure, your concentration risk, your income fragility, and your protection gaps. Ask yourself honestly, where is my structure weaker than it looks? Third, draft the blueprint. Do not stay financially reactive. If you want help thinking through your next step, schedule a complimentary 1-1 strategy session with our team. The link is in the video description. We can help you review your current structure, identify the biggest risks and gaps, and think through practical next steps for your family. Clarity usually comes after action, not before it, so don't wait for perfect certainty. Take the next step while you still have momentum. Let me close with this. The best way to predict the future is not simply to guess correctly, it is to build correctly. We cannot control every market cycle, every policy shift, every technological disruption, or every economic surprise, but we can build stronger systems, we can reduce fragility, we can improve retention, we can protect what matters, and we can make decisions earlier instead of later. In the AI era, families do not just need more information, they need better structure. So my encouragement is simple: do not drift into the future by default. Build with intention, build with clarity, build in alignment with your family's values, and build while you still have time on your side. Thank you so much for being here today.
If this sparked a new perspective, tell us what you're thinking.
Subscribe and grow with this early community. We publish weekly, breaking down the forces shaping your financial future, so you can move with clarity and confidence. Align Wealth 2040. Building wealth with intention.